Hey, this is Michael Bishop from OnGrid Solar. Wanted to talk with you quickly about setting custom defaults on the input sheet so you can have this set up for your typical customer, typical project, and avoid tedious data entry every time you start a new customer. I'm talking in January 2014. This is as of latest updates in 5.45, version 5.45, which made this all a lot smarter. So one thing I'm going to talk about is the new keyboard shortcut for quickly setting a default for one line item, rather than having to set the defaults for the entire input sheet through a link over here to the right, which could cause problems. I'll also talk about how to get back to an OnGrid default easily with another keyboard shortcut. Talk about some of the obvious defaults to set that I would want to set first thing using the OnGrid tool. And then also talk about some of the ways that we made defaults smarter in the latest version so that it's less likely that there's going to be any calculation errors or any problems like that. Just make sure that everything is smooth and flexible. So let's say I'm actually focusing on commercial more than residential these days, and I don't want to have to select from the drop-down list every time I start a new commercial customer. So I'm going to put in commercial here. And then from there, to set this as default, I'm going to do a keyboard shortcut, Control, Shift, and the letter D. So that's 3 keys, Control, Shift, and the letter D. And on Mac, make sure to hit Control, not the Command key. And I see a little pop-up, Custom Default Set. Now, if you're anything like me, well, I would immediately forget that because that's 3 keys. That's a lot of keys. So, but it is worth remembering, or at least getting a sticky note for a while, as you're optimizing your defaults in the input sheet to save yourself time. So, if you forget that one, there's a little no mouse icon up in the upper left corner of the spreadsheet, and clicking on that, get a pop-up with all sorts of different keyboard shortcuts that you can use in the OnGrid tool to fly around faster. Specifically, the second to last section, Set and Reset Line Item Default, I can see press Control and Shift and the letter D to set that line item as default. D as in default. If I wanted to get back to the OnGrid default, I can see Control and Shift and the letter R to reset back to the OnGrid default. So I've set my customer type as commercial. I happen to be based in Arizona. Not really, but in this example. So I'm going to do Arizona here. And to lock this in quickly, Control, Shift, and the letter D. Now let's say later I want to know, is this the OnGrid default or is this my own custom default? Which down below it's going to be more useful knowing which is still an OnGrid default and whatnot. So now that I did Control, Shift, D for this input, if I look up in the formula bar, I can see it says equals U44. Think of U as in user-defined. If it's U and followed by the active cell's row number, that's a user-defined. I've locked in that input. If it's O, I just clicked on the zip code. If it's O followed by the row number, think of O as an OnGrid. So that's an OnGrid default. So I know that I have not overridden that with my own custom default. So a couple more that I'm going to want to change right now is I'm going to want to say that most of my customers are under Tucson Electric Power, so I just selected that as my utility name, and I'm going to do a quick Control-Shift-D to lock that in. And then another big one that I'm going to do is Flagstaff, Arizona. I actually want to say Tucson, because I don't want to have to select from the drop-down list every time, so locked in Control-Shift-D. Now, just because I've locked this in as my default, it doesn't mean that I don't have other options. I still have all the other options that you would have if you're using the OnGrid default. But now, it's just going to default to my whatever I locked in. And it's going to go back to my default rather than the OnGrid default whenever I click on Reset Inputs up in the upper right, or whenever I start the OnGrid tool. Or if for any line item you can just do Control R and not Control Shift R, but Control R, and then I'll get it back to your default. If I wanted to get it back to the OnGrid default, Control Shift R, not just Control R. That'll do a full, clean, total reset. And again, those shortcuts, I'm throwing a lot of keyboard shortcuts at you, so I definitely suggest this no mouse icon if you'd like to speed all this up and be able to lock in your defaults quickly. So from there, I want to talk a little bit more about some of the perils of setting defaults that used to be hazardous, but now the OnGrid tool is smarter about it. So if I go into the system sizing section, maybe this is another thing that I wanted to lock in as a default. Maybe my typical system is 5 kilowatts. I could put that in there. Maybe down in the pricing section, this is a crazy high OnGrid default right now. I won't explain why, but $4. Okay, I will explain why. It's because I'm using a giant inverter on a small system, so automatic pricing is thrown off. All right, $4, Control-Shift-D, or let's say in this case, I went up and let's say I didn't want to bother with Control-Shift-D line by line. Instead, I just wanted to go through here with the specific intent of preparing my defaults, and then I wanted to go over and just do it all at once, clicking Make Current Inputs to Defaults. So when I do that, and then it will prompt me, are you sure I want to do this? Yeah, I'm definitely sure. It's going to give me some notices, just giving me a chance to not lock in some stuff. So it's saying, hey, the system size has been entered directly, because I typed in 5 kilowatts directly. By setting this as the custom default, a customer system won't be sized automatically. So I like that the OnGrid tool figures out the right system size based on whatever the customer's usage is and rate schedule is and whatnot. So I think I will exclude this from the new custom defaults. So I'm going to click yes here to exclude it. And then another one, I entered a cost per watt directly. Now, by entering a cost per watt directly, it's no longer looking towards the big table on the pricing sheet, where I can get very specific line by line, and also I can have different pricing customer by customer based on their situation. So I can say yes here and exclude that to keep it dynamic, which especially makes sense now that we have updated the pricing sheet last year and made it a lot smarter, a lot more robust. So I'm going to click yes here. Now those are just options. I could have definitely locked in a specific system size. Maybe I'm working with a very specific kit for all customers, or if I happen to know that my cost per watt is $4, or if I'm getting that from a different spreadsheet, I could have locked that in too. So that's totally optional. Another thing that's smarter in the latest version, as of the year 2014, is let's say that I have been working in Arizona, but in a few months I move to New Mexico and I start picking up more work in New Mexico, and that becomes the majority of my projects. When I type in New Mexico here, now, whereas before, recall that I locked in a Arizona utility as my default utility. So before, the OnGrid tool would be stuck on an Arizona utility, but now it's giving me a notice that I had locked in an Arizona utility. The following inputs have been overridden with custom defaults that won't change when the customer's site state is changed. So I can say reset these inputs to OnGrid defaults, and whereas right now I have these errors on the input sheet, by clicking yes, it just went from an Arizona utility over to a New Mexico utility, and I can look up in the formula bar and see equals O151. O is an OnGrid. So I know that it's been reset, and now it's totally dynamic. Whatever state I enter, it's going to follow it and get a right default utility for that state. So long story short, now it's a lot easier to get in here and hack away with setting up your proper defaults for your typical situation, but it's way more likely that you'll avoid calculation errors and confusing the OnGrid tool, given that it's now giving you notices. And that I've run through a few examples. There are a number of other examples of how it's smarter. So the big take-home message is to set any default, just click on that input, Control-Shift, and the letter D as in default. If that was a mistake, you'd like to get back to the OnGrid default, Control-Shift, and the letter R. When in doubt, or when when those keyboard shortcuts get hazy, you can click on this little no mouse icon up here to see the lay of the land with keyboard shortcuts. And that's that. If you have any feedback on how to make this even smarter, or feedback on anything else, any other ways that we can make the OnGrid tool easier to use for you, please let us know. Thanks for listening.